Okay, last time we looked at capital during the Gilded Age. Now we're going to look at labor during the Age of Enterprise. Now I want to do a quick summary of labor before and after the Civil War. Now these are generalizations. Some of the things going on before the Civil War continued on into the Gilded Age, while some of the characteristics of capital and labor in the Gilded Age were present long before the Civil War. But I think this is a good summary. More and more people were becoming wage laborers, meaning they depended on someone else to give them a paycheck. Before the Civil War, most Americans sold a product of their labor, not their labor. This is a key difference. When you sell a product of your labor, it usually means you're a skilled worker who creates something valuable with your skill. When you are a wage laborer, you still create something valuable, but you're selling your time, not what your skills produce. Now, before the Civil War, skilled labor was common, meaning a skilled worker made your shoes or chairs or other manufactured goods that you used in your household. They tended to make the whole thing from start to finish, so they would build the whole shoe or the whole table. Skilled workers sold the product of their labor, not their labor. They made their living off of a just wage, meaning a wage that would support them and their family. Oftentimes, skilled workers would agree on what prices to charge for things. That way they could always keep the prices high enough to support their families. Production tended to be on a small scale. Even big businesses tended to employ less than 100 people. And if you think about it, if you're in a factory or a shop with 100 people, chances are you might get to know everyone or at least recognize them when you see them. And a lot of this production is meant for local consumption. Skilled workers competed with other skilled workers in area of quality, not necessarily prices. So what would determine whether somebody bought your shoes versus someone else's shoes was the quality of those shoes, not whether your shoes were cheaper in price than the other person's. Now, after the Civil War, a lot of things start to change. Skilled labor is drastically replaced by unskilled labor, in which a worker only completed part of the process of manufacturing a good. Unskilled workers were wage laborers. They made their living by selling their time. They made their living off of a market wage, meaning they were paid the lowest possible price that the market would bear, and sometimes these prices aren't high enough for you to support your family. Production tended to be large scale, and big businesses operated factories that employed thousands of people. So, in a factory with 100, you can know everyone. In a factory with over 1,000, you're not going to know everyone, and you're probably not going to see your boss every day. Wage laborers competed with each other in price competition, meaning a businessman could cut the wages of his workers in order to undersell a competitor. So these are just some of the ways things changed before and after the Civil War. Now, laborers in the Gilded Age tended to work long days. 12-hour days, 6 days a week was often common. Some people worked 7 hours a day. There were no vacations. Maybe religious holidays were a vacation, but you didn't get 2 weeks off a year. There was no unemployment compensation. There was no sick leave. There was no accident insurance. You would often eat while you did your work. The work was very monotonous. Think about shoemaking, for example. Previously, skilled workers would sew the sole to the shoe. This took some talent, but now in the age of the factory, a worker didn't need to be skilled. All they needed to do was pull a lever on a machine that would connect the shoe to the sole, and they just did this process all day long. On top of that, there were unsafe working conditions. Thousands of workers died each year in railroad, mining, and factory accidents. Factory conditions were very poor. They were dirty. There was poor ventilation. Workers often breathed in dangerous fumes that shortened their lifespan. There was poor lighting that would hurt your eyes. There was dangerous equipment. Boilers often exploded, or, molten hot steel would get dumped on workers and they would be burned. I've got a couple quotes here just to kind of show you what life was like. So here's 3 quotes from 3 different workers. This first one is from a worker at Carnegie Steel. He says, quote, "Hard, I guess it's hard. I lost 40 pounds the first 3 months I came into this business. It sweats the life out of a man. I often drink 2 buckets of water during 12 hours. The sweat drips through my sleeves and runs down my legs and fills my shoes. Another worker at Carnegie Steel said, quote, "We stop only the time it takes to oil the engine, which was a stop of 3 to 5 minutes. While they are oiling, they eat, at least some of the boys, some of them. A great many of them in the mill do not carry anything to eat at all because they haven't got time to eat." Another worker said, "They wipe a man out here every little while. Sometimes a chain breaks and a ladle tips over and the iron explodes. Sometimes the slag falls on the workmen. Of course, if everything is working all smooth and a man watches out, while all right. But you take it after they've been on duty 12 hours with sleep and running like hell, everybody tired and loggy, and it's a different story." Like I said, injuries are commonplace. From 1880 to 1900, an average of 35,000 industrial workers are killed each year and another 500,000 wounded. So that's a lot of people killed every year. That's about 670 workmen being killed each week in America. There's child labor during the Gilded Age. Sometimes children as young as 5 years old work, maybe for 27 cents a day. Some of them work 14 hours a day. Sometimes factories are located in tenements or where people live. Children are often sought out because you can pay them cheaper wages. They're more obedient than workers, and they fit into small spaces. So in textile industries, they can get in between the machines. In the coal industry, they can fit in small places. Immigrants do a lot of the building in America. Throughout the Gilded Age, millions of immigrants come to America either through Ellis Island in New York or Angel Island in California. Immigrants had to be able to support themselves, and they had to be healthy. It was usually not the poorest people who came to America from places like Europe, but rather people who had enough money to pay for the trip to America. So the poorest of the poor are usually stuck in their home country. Immigration caused a lot of resentment on the part of American workers because there were always newly arriving immigrants looking for work, and this caused strikes to be ineffective. If American workers go on strike for better wages or safer conditions, the boss can just fire everyone because there's always a new batch of immigrants that want a job, and they'll take a job that's low pay and not very safe. Immigrants tended to follow relatives to America and live in ethnic neighborhoods. Ethnic origins usually determined what sort of work one would do. For example, the Welsh usually labored as tin plate workers. The English worked in the mines. The Germans were machinists and artisans. Belgians tended to work in glass factories. Scandinavians worked as sailors on American ships, and so on. You start to see a lot more women working outside the home during this era. There's something like 4 million women workers in 1900. Now, traditionally, wives worked in the home or on the farm alongside their husband, but this starts to change. Of those 4 million, about 1/3 of the women are domestic servants. Another third work as teachers or nurses, and the final third tend to work in textile mills or similar types of factories. But in the city, it's often a full-time job taking care of the children, doing the shopping, taking care of the home, cooking dinner. You don't have all the modern conveniences that allow you to microwave your dinner. So taking care of the family is a full-time job, just like the husband working in the factory. One of the biggest changes during the Gilded Age was that as labor becomes less skilled, it becomes more monotonous. This is often by design. Frederick W. Taylor was a pioneer in the field of scientific management. Basically, he tried to apply an engineer's approach to laborers. His goal was to eliminate the brain work and take away the workers' authority or autonomy, all in an effort to make laborers more efficient. And just to give you kind of an example of how this worked, there was actually manuals that explained to workers how to shovel properly. It would tell a worker which side to shovel from, how to step on the shovel, which side to turn to when delivering the load in the shovel, how many steps to take to dump the shovel, and how many steps to take returning to where you were digging. So they basically turn everything into a monotonous task, and everything's done by the book. I have a quote here from his book, The Principles of Scientific Management. So Frederick W. Taylor writes, The idea then of training a workman under a competent teacher into new working habits until he continually and habitually works in accordance with scientific laws which have been developed by someone else is directly antagonistic to the old idea that each workman can best regulate his own way of doing the work. The philosophy of the old management puts the entire responsibility upon the workman, while the philosophy of the new places a great part of it upon the management. A lot of workers hated this. One worker said, "The trade is so subdivided that a man is not considered a machinist at all. One man may make just a particular part of a machine and may not know anything whatever about another part of the same machine. Such a worker is not a master of craft, but only a master of fragment." A lot of workers took pride in what they built. So if you build a whole product, you can look at that at the end of the day and say, that's what I created. But if you only do one part of the process, at the end of the day, you didn't really make anything. You just contributed a little bit to a lot of stuff. Another worker said, "It looks to me like slavery to have a man stand over you with a stopwatch. This system is wrong because we want our heads left on us. So under scientific management, you would time your workers and try to get the most speed out of them that you could." Because of all this, you start to have the growth of the labor movement during the Gilded Age. Now, labor unions existed before the Civil War, but because business starts to get big after the Civil War, you start to have the growth of labor unions. Now, there were different approaches taken by workers throughout this period. Some workers thought we should join political parties and influence laws. Some workers said stay out of politics, just focus on collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is when all the workers get together and pick a representative who goes and talks to the boss and says, we want $1 a day pay increase. We want to work 8 hours a day instead of 12. We want better safety conditions. And then you kind of negotiate with your boss. So some of them thought stay out of politics, go do collective bargaining. There's also something called trade unions or craft unions. These had existed before the Civil War. These trade unions are made up of skilled workers in an industry. So for example, all the carpenters in the nation might belong to a carpenters union, or the bricklayers would belong to a bricklayers union. They would meet the everyday needs of their workers. So this includes things like pay, hours, safety, help for fellow workers who are hurt on the job or get killed. So these trade unions are kind of like fraternal organizations that look out for each other. Trade unions were closed shops, meaning only a member of a union could be employed. So maybe there's a city and the carpenters are unionized into a trade union. They wouldn't really want anyone to do carpentry work who was not a part of their union. So this closed shop keeps out low-wage workers and sometimes incompetent workers who don't really know the craft very well. One of the most famous early unions was called the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor, or just Knights for Labor for short, Knights of Labor for short. This was kind of a secret society founded in 1869 in Philadelphia, but it eventually spreads to other cities. It kind of functions like a social club for workers. There were secret rituals, there was camaraderie, there were financial dues that were paid. The Knights of Labor was led by Terence V. Powderly. He's kind of the leader of their union. The Knights of Labor support cooperation within industries. They want factories and shops to be run by employees. And as more and more people see how this cooperation works, they hope that this will catch on. So their goal is to educate the American public on how cooperation in the factory system will work. So they use lectures, discussions, and publications to kind of spread their beliefs. Over time, they think producers will also become members of these cooperatives. The Knights push for other reforms as well, such as the 8-hour workday, equal pay for men and women, and the end of child labor. The Knights of Labor admit both skilled and unskilled workers to their union. They admit blacks, they admit women, they admit immigrants. They don't exclude anybody. And by 1886, the Knights had about 700,000 members, so they're the biggest labor union in the country. Now, there's another big union in the Gilded Age, and this union will actually be a lot more important later on when we get into the 1930s, but this is the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL. It was led by Samuel Gompers, who was a Dutch Jewish immigrant. His family came to America in 1863, and Gompers worked as a cigar maker. Now, Gompers is a very intellectual man. He wasn't formally educated, but he would pay people to read to him while he labored at making cigars. A lot of people actually did that while they worked in their factory or at their shop. They would pay someone to come teach them, educate them as they worked. Now, Gompers was an advocate of what he called pure and simple unionism. The pure meant that workers would be organized based on craft. So if you are a railroad engineer, all the railroad engineers would be in a union. If you were a steel manufacturer or steel worker, all the steel workers would be organized in a union. The simple refer to only things that immediately benefited workers, so things like wages, hours, working conditions, and job security. Samuel Gompers and the American Federation of Labor focuses on collective bargaining, not political activities. So they're not trying to take over the political parties and foment revolution or anything. The AFL is founded in 1886, basically when some trade unions break with the Knights of Labor. Gompers serves as their first president. Like I said, the AFL does not push revolution. They do exclude who can join their union. So that the American Federation of Labor only allows skilled workers in. Unskilled workers, women, blacks, or recent immigrants are usually kept out of their union. Now, I want to look at 4 major strikes or labor disputes that happened during the Gilded Age. From 1880 to 1900, there's something like 37,000 strikes in the United States. So too many to talk about, but these 4 are the most important ones. The first one is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Sometimes it's called the Great Uprising or the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. In 1873, there was a series of bank failures that triggered a 5-year depression. This event in 1873 is known as the Panic of 1873. It and the depression that followed greatly impacted the nation's railroads. We've kind of talked about how railroads are vital to the nation. The whole national marketplace utilizes railroads. 89 railroads go bankrupt in 1873, and by 1875, over 18,000 companies in America went bankrupt. These were the causes of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, but the spark was provided by the workers of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was run by John W. Garrett, and he decides to cut the wages of his railroad workers. And, when the economy is bad, workers are usually the ones who suffer first. Railroad workers in the East had faced a series of wage cuts, and depending on how you calculate it, the cuts amounted to something between 20 and 30% of their pay. In addition to pay cuts, many railroads also decided at this point to create new rules that took the management of on-the-job work away from laborers and gave it to the managers. This is important. If you were a worker at a railroad yard, oftentimes the workers were in charge of safety. So the workers would decide how best to do the job, because they're the ones that are going to get hurt if you kind of rush work and are careless. So in addition to wage cuts, the railroads also say we want to start taking over those everyday rules that kind of govern how you work, and the workers didn't like this. Workers in Maryland went on strike in July of 1877, and these strikes soon spread across America. You can see from this map all these different places that the railroad strikes occur. So this is a national strike, and this is the first national strike in American history. Workers block trains, they take over railroad yards. Most railroads east of the Mississippi are involved, but some in California are go on strike as well. Something like 50,000 miles of track is shut down. Freight shipping comes to a halt. Most railroad traffic in this age is freight shipping, so that's kind of what gets shut down. A lot of railroad owners ask governors and the federal government to send in troops to kind of stop the strikes. Some governors do send in the state militias, but the militia sometimes side with the strikers, so they were not always reliable in putting down a strike. In Philadelphia, the militia threw in the towel and let the strikers go about their way. The strikers ended up burning 2,000 railroad cars. They destroyed 40 buildings, and they tore up 3 miles of the Pennsylvania Railroad in July of 1877. So sometimes the state militia doesn't even stop this stuff. Now, President Rutherford B. Hayes does send in federal troops to kind of stop the strikers in different states, and federal troops are usually more successful. By the end of the summer, the strikes were mostly over. Many railroads restored their workers' pay, but they did not relinquish back control over who made the rules for on-the-job work and the day-to-day work that goes on in the railroad yards. I've got a quote by Tom Scott, the owner of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He said this about the strikers: "Give them a rifle diet for a few days and see how they like that kind of bread." So some of these railroad executives just want the federal troops to shoot the strikers and put this down. So eventually this strike ends. The next one that I want to talk about is the Haymarket Riot of 1886. Trade unions nationwide had demanded an 8-hour workday, and they set May 1st, 1886 as the deadline for factory owners to meet their demands. Now, there was a strike going on at the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company. Workers at this company went on strike. McCormick, the owner, brought in strike breakers, and there's a battle at the factory on May 3rd of 1886 between workers and police and private detectives. 4 strikers are killed. So this infuriates a lot of the workers, and they call for a demonstration to take place on May 4th, 1886 in Haymarket Square. Now, a large crowd shows up at Haymarket to hear speeches by workers to kind of show solidarity in the cause. But within these workers, there's also a lot of anarchists. Anarchy is kind of seen as a radical ideology that's from Europe. It's not American. What ends up happening is while this speeches are going on, somebody ends up throwing a bomb into a group of policemen. Several police are killed. The police open fire on the crowd and kill some of the workers. You have an incident of violence. Now, some of the anarchists did print flyers telling people to bring weapons to this meeting at Haymarket. So there is this push by anarchists for violence. But what ends up happening is a lot of people that are arrested after the Haymarket incident didn't actually kill anybody. They're not involved in this. They're just charged with murder for basically inciting others to kill. Eventually, 8 anarchists are arrested. 4 of them are executed. 1 commits suicide in prison. The rest receive prison sentences that are later commuted by the governor of Illinois. In the aftermath of the Haymarket Riot, one of the things that comes to light or becomes a part of American life is called the Yellow Dog Contract. This is where employers force workers to sign a contract promising not to join a union as a condition for their employment. So what happens is before you can get a job, you have to promise you'll never join a union. If at some point you join a union, they can fire you because you're violating your contract. Labor groups such as the Knights of Labor never really recover after the Haymarket Riot. Their numbers plummet. Americans don't really like radicalism. They like law and order. They like people to be able to practice their right of private property. So normally if workers go on strike, if the workers are peaceful and they have reasonable demands, a lot of times Americans will side with them, but once violence occurs, most Americans turn against the strikers. Probably the most famous strike is the Homestead Strike of 1892. This happens at the Homestead Steel Works plant in Pennsylvania. Andrew Carnegie bought this plant in 1883. Workers ran this steel mill through a union, so it's kind of a cooperative. They have a lot of autonomy. The workers kind of decide how things function at this factory, and Carnegie decides that he's going to break the union. So he goes on vacation in Europe, and he puts his right-hand man in charge of the situation. His name is Henry Clay Frick. The workers' contracts are about to expire in June of 1892, so Henry Clay Frick closes down the factory and says you can come back to work once you sign a new contract that says you are not going to be a part of a union. The workers don't do this. They go on strike. Henry Clay Frick brings in strike breakers. He built a huge wall around the factory called Frick's Fort. This wall was 11 feet tall. It had barbed wire. But the workers succeed in keeping out a lot of the strike breakers. Basically, the two sides negotiate, and what ends up happening is Henry Clay Frick brings in 300 Pinkerton detectives to kind of force the workers to let the strike breakers come in. And on July 6th, 1892, there's a battle. The Pinkertons sail along the Monongahela River on a barge. They float up to Homestead to kind of take over the factory and the city. Well, the workers are waiting for them, and there's a gunfight. This gunfight lasts something like 14 hours. The workers lit railroad cars on and filled them full of explosives and rolled them down the riverbank at the Pinkertons. They threw dynamite at the Pinkertons. There's gunfire. People are killed. The workers defeat the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons surrender. But eventually what ends up happening is the Pennsylvania state militia goes in. Something like 8,500 troops are called in by the governor of Pennsylvania, and they take over the mill from the workers. So the strike is broken, and the workers eventually come back as non-union workers. This Homestead strike really tarnished Andrew Carnegie's reputation. He kind of had a reputation before the Homestead strike as a friend of workers. He tended to pay his workers more than other factories. Steel factories, but after this, workers kind of looked down on him. The last strike is called the Pullman Strike of 1894. Once again, this strike has its origins in an economic downturn that's known as the Panic of 1893. The economy had been growing very fast in the years before, and a lot of railroads overextended themselves during these good economic times. In February 1893, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad goes bankrupt. In July of 1893, the Erie Railroad goes bankrupt, and others follow. The stock market collapses. By the fall, 8,000 businesses have failed. Something like 400 banks have failed, and over 150 railroads. George Pullman is going to be at the center of this strike. He had invented and produced luxury cars for train travel. These are known as the Pullman cars. He builds a factory near Chicago to produce them. At this factory, he builds a company town called Pullman. Now, workers live in this town. It has neat homes for them. It has churches, shops, a theater, library, legal and medical offices. So one of the things you see during the Gilded Age is, in addition to philanthropy, the company town is another way that captains of industry tried to look after their workers and help alleviate poverty. You can kind of see some of the pictures of the Pullman car and its luxury, and also what the company town of Pullman looked like. Now, Pullman, just like everybody else, is not immune to the bad economy, and because of the downturn, he lays off about 3,000 workers, but he also cuts the wages of the workers who he doesn't lay off. But one thing he doesn't do is cut their rent. So workers would get a paycheck from Pullman, but then they would also pay Pullman to live in his company town. So he cuts their wages, but he doesn't cut their rent. So the workers go on strike at Pullman. They're led by Eugene V. Debs. He's a very famous American socialist, and he's leader of the American Railway Union. He's going to be very important in the early 1900s. He grew up in Indiana, became involved in the labor movement there. He's a presidential candidate in 1900, 1904, 1908, 1912, and 1920. He's always running for president. Debs talks socialism kind of in an American idiom. He tries to make Marxism appeal to ordinary citizens. He gets involved with the brother of locomotive firemen. That's the first union he joins, but later he becomes head of the American Railway Union. The American Railway Union is open to all railroad workers, regardless of their skill. But Pullman workers go on strikes. They're led by Eugene V. Debs. The strike calls for workers to boycott all trains associated with Pullman or his Pullman cars. So as a result, a lot of the nation's railways get shut down because a lot of them have Pullman cars attached to them. What this does is this interferes with the federal mail. Trains would carry mail all over the United States, and now the mail is not being delivered. So this gives President Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, a reason to send in federal troops. His pretense is he wants to get the mail running again. The Pullman strike does come to an end once troops are sent in. There's also a court injunction issued against Debs to stop the strike. Debs doesn't, and he goes to jail, where he comes out more radical. In 1901, he helps launch the Socialist Party of America, and we'll talk more about Debs later on. Now, what do we take away from these strikes during the Gilded Age? Well, for one thing, labor union membership drops. It had been on the rise, but Americans are turned off by radicalism and violence. Americans see things like anarchism, socialism, and communism as foreign ideologies. These ideologies are kind of un-American. They don't have respect for private property. They don't have respect for individual freedom. They don't allow for limited government. So they turn a lot of Americans off. They even turn a lot of American workers off. American workers want better wages, better conditions, but they don't want foreign ideologies corrupting America. Many workers are patriotic Americans. So Americans like law and order. They lose sympathy for the more radical elements of these strikers. You see federal troops used to shut down a lot of these strikes. And you start to see a growing resentment between labor and capital. So that's kind of a summary of the labor side of the Age of Enterprise. Next time we'll kind of talk about foreign policy during this period.